Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, here to support you in overcoming disordered eating and finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Today I want to talk to you about mantra, which is a cognitive interpersonal therapy treatment for anorexia nervosa, created by the Maudsley Hospital in London, created by Ulrika Schmidt, Janet Treasure and Helen Startup and their team. Now, mantra is designed for anorexia nervosa treatment, but there are many elements of the treatment which are incredibly valuable for anyone suffering from an eating disorder. And the mantra tool is one of the tools within the manual. Now, if you are interested in buying the book, it is called A Cognitive Interpersonal Therapy Workbook for Treating Anorexia Nervosa, the Maudsley Model by Ulrika Schmidt, Helen Startup and Janet Treasure. And you can find that on Amazon. But mantra is now used in many eating disorder services, often delivered as group therapy for people struggling, usually specifically with anorexia nervosa. But as I've said, it's great, has some great resources in it, which are so helpful for anyone suffering from an eating disorder. Now, the mantra flower is a lovely visual tool. Think of a lovely daisy with a central yellow disc and the white petals going outward. Now, the mantra flower is a tool to help you visually recognize the different things that might keep your eating disorder going. Now, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to an article I've written on Substack, which has an image of the mantra flower in it. So you can go and have a look at that there. Or if you literally put into Google the mantra flower Maudsley model, it will come up for you as well. So if you just want to have that kind of visual, it's very easily accessible. Okay. But what the mantra flower does is it provides a visual tool to help you recognize the different things that might keep your eating disorder going. Now remember, an eating disorder is a coping strategy, a psychological coping strategy for life struggles. Now, it's often not a chosen one, but a focus on body image or food can be a way to feel safe, gain a sense of control, maybe numb or distract from difficult emotions, and give a sense of purpose and identity. Now, as I always say on my podcast, that no one consciously wakes up one day and thinks, right, I'm going to cope with life by turning to food and body. It often starts off with quite an innocent diet, maybe trying to be healthy. And it starts often from a very I'd say honourable place, really. No one wants to get an eating disorder, or sometimes people just lose their appetite, don't eat enough because they're so stressed, and then they find themselves kind of going down that eating disorder path once some of the starvation symptoms start to kick in. So there can be many sort of ways into it, but it's not a conscious choice. Now, each petal on the mantra flower signifies a factor that keeps the eating disorder going. So in mantra, they call it a vicious flower, as it's keeping someone locked into coping through unhelpful means. So I'm going to talk through the different aspects that keep an eating disorder going. So with the mantra flower, they divide it into 4 different aspects. And I'm going to talk through each of these. So it's really valuable to understand this. If you're a carer listening as well, or maybe a good friend of someone with an eating disorder, it will help you to really understand your loved one better. And once you appreciate how an eating disorder may be serving you or helping you, you can also become more compassionate towards yourself in understanding why you're using it. Because I think sometimes people just say to themselves, oh my goodness, I'm being so ridiculous. Why can't I just eat normally? What's wrong with me? And that kind of attitude towards yourself often will result in a lot of shame, really drive that inner critic, and you just feel hopeless and stuck. So it's starting to realize that, this is a coping strategy, not one that you have chosen, but your eating disorder is helping you feel safe. It is a safe life raft to cling to when life is feeling overwhelming, too much, turbulent, all those things. So the mantra flower really helps to give you awareness, because once you can understand how the ED is helping you to survive, to cope, you can begin to think about, okay, well, how can I meet some of these needs in other constructive ways? So rather than numbing my emotions by not eating or binging, how could I begin to meet those emotional needs in other ways? When I'm feeling sad, what is it that I need? When I'm feeling anxious, what is it that I need? So it starts to bring awareness, so you have a more empowered view to think about how you can change things, how you can cope differently. This is very possible. Many people have recovered from eating disorders, and sometimes it's just having this deeper understanding, getting the psychological tools, and having some patience and support that you can get through the other side. So let's talk about some of the different petals of the flower. So number one is the valued nature of an eating disorder. So for anyone listening, you might think, well, what is valuable about an eating disorder? I don't get it. This is just really destructive. How can an eating disorder be valued? But as I've talked about before, an eating disorder is a way of coping. So yes, the eating disorder may have many different aspects about it which are unhelpful. Maybe someone's cold, they have really poor concentration, maybe they're not engaging with their friends, maybe they've had to, drop out of college or something. Maybe it's really impacting their marriage, their relationships. It could be having so many negative impacts. However, if the eating disorder is really providing that life raft, if it's providing that identity, maybe it is, helping them cope with their emotions, whatever, it's really valued. And of course, then, if someone is really valuing their eating disorder, they're not really going to want to let go of it, because it just feels like it's something really special. So with the valued nature of the eating disorder, the mantra flower, they sort of talk about the eating disorder as identity. So often someone with an eating disorder might really identify with, like, I'm the thin person, I'm the one that's funny around food, I'm the one that's like really healthy, I'm the person that does loads and loads of exercise. So that identity feels like very positive, and people in that person's life might really validate and praise their behaviour because of the culture that we live in. I know it's quite dysfunctional in many ways, but actually the culture that we live in will often praise you if you have lost loads of weight, even if you are taking laxatives, purging, and the person has no idea how you are achieving those goals, but you will still be praised. So you can still very much feel like, I am doing a good thing here. So the eating disorder starts to really take on a bit of an identity, and it might even be an identity as the sick person, the person who is really small and needs taking care of. Sometimes being the sick person can feel very safe. If you've had lots of difficulties and things that have happened in your life, actually, if you are sick, maybe you feel protected from some of those difficulties and those overwhelming responsibilities. It means that other people can step in and look after you. Okay, so it's just really understanding this identity piece. And the other thing is the pro-anorexia or pro-eating disorder beliefs. Now, particularly with anorexia nervosa, we say in therapy that it's egosyntonic. And this means it's an egosyntonic condition because of what that means is someone with anorexia nervosa or an eating disorder can often really like aspects of the eating disorder. Some of the aspects can feel really positive. They can feel like, I'm doing something really morally superior. I can restrict food much better than other people. I am worthy. Somehow I'm better than other people. I think this is a hard thing, isn't it, for us to admit, really. None of us like to think of ourselves as superior and looking down on others. But if you are not feeling that great about yourself, if your self-esteem is on the floor, but then you feel that you can become really good at restricting food, really good at kind of controlling your eating, in a way you can do something that half the world is trying to do and is in battle against, really. And you can feel like, I can do this one thing really well that other people can't do. And you may feel like this has almost become your special thing. And you might think, well, I'm not so good in other areas of my life, but at least I can really restrict food well. And that's like a pro-anorexia, a pro-eating disorder belief. And it makes it hard to let go of it because of actually that can just feel really, really true. Particularly when we're living in a culture where we're always being told to lose weight, where everyone who is really, really skinny is photographed and praised, etc., etc., etc. You can feel like, I am just doing something really well. I'm acing this restriction. And even if behind closed doors you're binging and purging and chewing and spitting and your world is in absolute chaos, that external validation from the outside can still feel really good if your self-esteem is on the floor and you feel like this is the one thing I have in my life. So the second thing that can keep an eating disorder going, according to the mantra flower, is the social and emotional mind. And what this means is that the eating disorder becomes a way of coping with relationships and with emotions. Now, if you have an eating disorder, you may feel that you're not great at dealing with emotions or dealing with relationships. Maybe with your emotions, you feel that you either tend to shut them down, not express them, hold them inside, maybe take them out on yourself. And maybe also you might numb them with eating, with chewing and spitting, with purging behaviors. You might use all kinds of ways to kind of deal with your emotions. And you may feel that your emotions are like untamed beasts that kind of spring forth and take over you, and you're almost quite scared of them. You feel like you can lose your kind of cool very quickly. Maybe you can 1 minute feel really angry and then really sad, and maybe your emotions just feel all over the place and very chaotic. So actually, emotions might not feel very safe. And that is often probably rooted in your early childhood, probably the first 10 years of your life, and how you experienced with your primary caretakers, with the people that you spent most time with. How did they model expression and dealing with emotions? How do they model these things to you? Were they able to express their feelings? Were you able to express your feelings safely? And were you able to be comforted and taken care of, perhaps when you were feeling sad or angry or anxious? How were these emotions dealt with? And then the second part as well, I think it's very connected to this, is our difficulties in relationships. Now, I know as well, some people that may be listening as well, maybe neurodivergent. If you have autism or ADHD, maybe you have had some struggles in your relationships and feeling understood. Maybe you're in a pattern of masking and having to perform to the world to feel safe. And I think, though, this is something as well that doesn't just happen if you are neurodiverse. I think many people who are neurotypical also struggle with this, a lot with sort of people pleasing, feeling that they have to sort of show up in their relationships in a very conditional way to be accepted. And this brings up lots of sort of difficulties and difficult emotions. So the eating disorder becomes a way of coping with relationships and emotions. And it can be a way sometimes of communicating needs that cannot be expressed out loud. So it can communicate anger, frustration, loneliness, sadness, maybe feelings that someone feels they don't have permission to express in more healthy ways. Now, often I think, particularly with anorexia nervosa, when someone becomes very underweight, very thin, people around them tend to worry. They tend to step in. They tend to notice something isn't right. So if you have found it perhaps very hard to communicate and get your voice heard and your needs met, actually, if you suddenly lose a lot of weight, this isn't always a conscious thing, but it can be a way of communicating your needs through your physical body, almost as a profound statement. And it will, get people to react and actually take notice of you. And maybe you feel that you couldn't say things out loud. You couldn't communicate your distress out loud because you're really worried you would upset people, or it wouldn't be acceptable, or you feel that you are undeserving of having these feelings and needs. So in a way, you communicate this through your body. And it's not just about kind of getting thinner as well. It could be through other eating disorder behaviors as well. So things like starving, binging, over-exercising can be a distraction from emotions and a numbing or dumbing down so you don't have to feel the pain. Now, if you are counting calories all the time, thinking about your next binge, thinking about getting your steps in, you don't really have to deal with what's beneath the surface. The eating disorder, in a way, is a very welcome distraction, and it may still cause you quite a lot of pain and upset and turmoil, but that can still feel easier and more reliable in a way to deal with than actually dealing with maybe the deeper pain that's underneath. Maybe there are things going on in your life. There's been a relationship breakdown or a bereavement, or something's happening in the future that you feel really, really worried about. And it could be all kinds of things beneath the surface. But the focus on food and body image is a way to feel safe, almost like a life raft to cling to when below that you are really, really struggling. So an eating disorder sometimes as well can kind of simplify life, because you can feel like, well, I can kind of deal with the emotions around food more easily perhaps than with other people. And maybe, I feel safer in a relationship with food and the weighing scales, and this kind of relationship that I'm having with the eating disorder, that feels safer in a way than being able to trust and be in relationship with people close to me. So see if you reflect on, see what kind of makes sense to you from this, and reflect on this, and just kind of notice really, like, if you resonate here, what do you think might be below your eating disorder? What difficult emotions might be there? What difficulties might be present in your life around your relationships? And I think, you can just start to tune in to yourself and explore these questions. You don't have to act on anything yet or even talk to anyone about it, but the first step is really starting to get to know yourself and honouring those thoughts and feelings. Okay, the next kind of petals on the mantra flower are around your thinking styles. So if you have particularly a very restrictive eating disorder, so again, mantra is designed primarily for anorexia nervosa. So then they talk about having very inflexible thinking and really focusing on excessive details. But this doesn't just happen when someone has anorexia nervosa. It could be, again, across the eating disorders, but it's probably going to be stronger when there's an element of restriction and starvation as part of your eating disorder, because of when we become very restrictive around food, it makes us really anxious. We become really inflexible. We focus much more on the detail. We become rigid. We can't really be spontaneous and free anymore. I think what's really important to say is that it doesn't matter if you're not underweight as well, because sometimes people think, well, I'm not underweight, so this restriction doesn't really count. But if you're restricting or starving, whatever your weight, you'll be experiencing physical symptoms, and this will render your eating more inflexible and detail focused, and your life more inflexible and detail focused. So what tends to happen as well when we're in a place of restriction, we become really black and white. If you are prone to any sort of obsessive compulsive disorder thoughts, they will become much more intense and amplified. But just generally, you become a lot more rigid. You'll be thinking in extremes. You've lost your flexibility in thinking. Everything's very polarized. And what tends to happen as well is if you're restricting, you think a lot about food. And, the mantra nutrition module really shows that, different body mass indexes, and I know there's limitations to body mass index, but this is just a guide, but it shows at different body mass indexes the level of preoccupation with food. And even if you are, just a bit underweight and not in the anorexia nervosa weight range, you could still be having 60% of your thoughts a day around food, weight, routines, etc. Now, when you become extremely unwell, almost perhaps at the stage we might be going into hospital, you're probably almost thinking about food 100% of the time. And I think I heard someone recently say about 100% plus, because you're actually dreaming about food at night as well. So you just have no let up from it. And then I guess there are many kind of increments in between where you will still be having a very high preoccupation with food. Whereas I guess someone that has a healthy relationship with food might be thinking about food, 10, 15% per day. But it's very much much more in a kind of functional need to kind of basis rather than this obsession. So starvation makes your thinking very inflexible, and it becomes this awful perpetuating cycle where thoughts around food and rigidity are excessive, they're continuous, they create further thoughts, and you just kind of get caught in this awful loop. And ways this shows up as well is, perhaps when you have to be inflexible, you have to eat at a specific time, you have to eat at a specific place, you have to eat specific foods. The detail of it as well, you get really obsessed about any minor changes in weight, the excessive detail focus on calories. If you go 10 calories over what you think that you should be eating, it's sort of devastating, you feel out of control, etc., etc. So you almost become like so perfectionist, so rigid, so obsessive. It's really a prison and not a pleasant place to be. So notice, do you relate to this? And I guess just to say to you that actually, if you can start to implement some regular eating and nourish yourself better, the thinking styles, the rigidity, the inflexibility, the excessive detail focus will reduce so much, almost automatically, almost straight away. And you'll be so much less preoccupied with food. So much about preoccupation with food is about undereating and starvation, whatever size your body is. So moving on to the fourth area on the mantra flower is how others keep the eating disorder going. Now, this isn't intentional, because who wants to be encouraging an eating disorder? I don't think anyone does. As carers, as therapists, as loved ones, however, we can often get unintentionally drawn into unhelpful ways of helping. Okay, so we so want to help the person, we so want to do the right thing, we care so much, but we really often get drawn in, okay? So we might enable eating disorder behaviours because we don't want conflict, or we don't want to confront the reality of the situation. So say, for example, if someone is just not really eating enough at all, we may buy really low calorie foods for them at their request. If they're wanting to exercise more, we might get pulled into exercising more with them. We may start to be dominated by their routines, even if they are really inflexible and not very helpful, because we don't want to cause any conflict and encourage, so we inadvertently always encourage the behaviours more. Now, I think this is a really, really tough thing to manage, because I think as a parent, a carer, what you don't want to do is start really pushing back in a very harsh way. Thinking about the new Maudsley animal model, if you become very sort of directive and bossy, even with good intentions, you would become, as the new Maudsley model says, the rhino, where you are creating a lot of friction, a lot of over control. And what tends to happen then is the person will really sort of push back at you, rebel more, probably become more entrenched in their eating disorder behaviours. So I guess there's a tough balance to strike, really, because also we don't want to be enabling the eating disorder by, just kind of going around all the houses to just like really almost, I want to say feed the situation, but don't really want to use that pun, but you know what I'm saying. And I guess when we become an enabler, really, we are what would be called in the new Maudsley animal model as well sometimes, is we are the kangaroo with the joey. So we almost pick up the joey, our loved one who is struggling, we put them in the pouch. We want them to be so safe and warm and looked after. We don't want to cause any friction for them. We want it all to be lovely. We want to just, look after them and do our utmost best to support them. And I think, if someone's really unwell, a bit of kangaroo and joeying, a bit of enabling may be helpful in the short term. But for anyone for the long term, actually, if the joey's in the pouch too long, the joey doesn't want to get out the pouch, because of actually, the world is a bit scary and overwhelming and full of fearful situations sometimes. And sometimes you don't want to get out the pouch because of actually it's very protected in there. So it can almost be a way of shielding you from adult life. And actually the kangaroo has got great intentions there, but is almost, really enabling the eating disorder. And actually, as the joey, you become very disempowered. You enjoy perhaps being in the pouch. It feels very safe, but it's also really smothering and a bit overwhelming. And you start to think, oh my goodness, I couldn't cope if I was outside the pouch. I don't want to let go of this eating disorder. So the eating disorder starts to have almost a secondary gain of getting care and attention and really being looked after. So the other way that loved ones sometimes can keep an eating disorder going is through very high expressed emotions. So in the new Maudsley animal model, this would be referred to as the jellyfish. So the jellyfish becomes very anxious, sad, angry, really high expressed emotions. If the loved one comes to them and says, look, I'm really struggling, blah, 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 the carer will become very, very anxious, overwhelmed, sad, angry, and will express that emotion to their loved one. And then the loved one tends to think, oh my goodness, I'm just too much of a burden. I can't talk to my carer. I'm just causing my carer so much distress. I need to shut down and deal with things on my own. And again, they become more entrenched in the eating disorder. So, and I want to say as well, if you're a carer listening, huge compassion to you, because I think it's really hard if you've got a teenager, a young adult struggling or younger, and you can see they're really struggling. As a parent, it's a very natural thing to feel very strongly emotional about this situation. So I think in a way it's not saying to you, you can't have your emotions, but what you need to do is take those emotions to a counsellor or a good friend or a partner, vent those there. So then it means that when you are with your loved one, you can show up more in a calm, present way, which will be more helpful for them. Because if you can, as a carer, provide that container, so in the new Maudsley animal model, it talks about being the St. Bernard dog. So the St. Bernard dog is like kind, really consistent, really caring, really present, like in a way, like, I think it's such a great metaphor, really, because, just imagine that St. Bernard dog sitting there, like, just with so much kind of calm and peace. And, St. Bernards as well are kind of, you really can't sort of knock them over easily, can you? You kind of know that they're pretty solid, really. They're going to be there for you. That's a really kind of good feeling of safety. And the other animal to be as a carer is a dolphin. So the dolphin swims alongside, asks open questions, listens, does lots of active listening, is encouraging, but doesn't really give advice, doesn't step in, really sees the person struggling as someone with infinite potential who has all the resources within them, and actually, maybe they're not accessing those resources yet, but you have complete faith in them in a way that they are going to recover. And if you think in your own life, when someone has believed in you and really believe that you can do amazing things and step outside your comfort zone, I hope if you're listening that you have someone in your life who has thought that of you. But if you can go back to that memory and just realise how empowered and encouraged and supported you felt in a way when the other person really believes in you. Because when people don't believe in us, when they put their anxieties, their fears, their projections onto us, it makes us feel really disempowered. We feel like, oh my goodness, I'm hopeless, I'm overwhelmed, I'll never get out of this. Whereas when someone believes in you, you believe like, okay, I can do it. I can take the next step. Okay. So I hope that's kind of helpful, giving you some things to reflect on. So I love the mantra flower. I think it's such a helpful tool to understand what can keep an eating disorder going. And you can draw out your own mantra flower to see all the different factors. So as I said, again, like either Google it, you can put in Maudsley mantra flower eating disorder on Google, you will get it up. I'll also though link in the show notes to my Substack article about mantra, and you can access the image there as well. So you can begin to think about change and how you can get your needs met more helpfully rather than in these dysfunctional ways. So, again, when you start to think about how can you get some of these needs met in more positive ways. So it might be things like communicating your needs in relationships, talking openly and sharing through words and expressing feelings. Now, of course, your relationships need to feel safe for you to do this. You don't want to be expressing your deepest feelings to someone who's going to get really angry and stamp all over them. You want to be in a safe relationship. You can also learn problem-solving skills to boost self-worth and self-reliance to cope with the challenges of life without having to kind of use the ED to avoid or hide from things. Because although the pouch of the ED can feel very seductive, it's also very disempowering. You can find identity and purpose as well through more meaningful avenues and the pursuit even of thinness or muscularity. There's nothing wrong per se with chasing certain aesthetic goals, but you're never going to find true inner peace and nirvana by being the thinnest or the leanest person in the room. You are really not. Eating more regularly, nourishing yourself, self-caring to balance blood sugar, and this will reduce rigid thinking and help you become more flexible. So these are just some examples. So the mantra flower is a tool. It's not just for anorexia, it's helpful for all the eating disorders. And it's such a good starting point to understand how the eating disorder is serving you, and it opens the door to becoming more self-compassionate, understanding the psychology of an eating disorder, and giving you awareness and insight to consider the change process. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much for listening. If you're not following me already, do see me on Instagram at the eating disorder therapist _. And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would be so grateful if you follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.